Now, it is of interesting note and timing that today, as we're debating this bill and the government listening to New Democrats and to First Nations and to the territorial governments, we also see the report by Mr. Douglas Eyford, released just hours ago. Now this one's called Forging Partnerships and Building Relationships. It's an important title. This is the special commission the Prime Minister just mentioned at the end of question period, that for many, many years, this Conservative government has absolutely ignored the will and intent of First Nations people across all of Canada, and in particular across British Columbia. They seem to approach the whole conversation around pipelines and resource development as a conversation of inconvenience with the people who happen to live along the route, that happen to be most affected by these projects. And we are not an inconvenience. We are central to the conversation. First Nations in particular, who have a constitutionally protected right, who have land that is not ceded, that rights and responsibilities should be afforded them because the courts say so, because our Constitution says so. And yet the Prime Minister had to go out and hire a special envoy who did a remarkable job, I might add, Mr. Speaker, who went, lo and behold, to the communities affected, talked to the very First Nations who are impacted and asked them for their opinion. What a revelatory idea, Mr. Speaker, that the government had to go out and hire a special consultant to do the government's job, to go and listen to First Nations people and find out what they were interested in, to actually begin to believe and put truth to the idea of what Section 35 of our Charter guarantees, which is the obligation of the Crown, the federal government, to consult and accommodate. To consult and then accommodate. Consult means that you sit down, you understand the people, you listen to their interests and their worldview, and you try to come to some sort of accommodation over the impacts that may happen to them if a mine or a pipeline or any serious resource development were to go ahead. And yet somehow for this government, for this Prime Minister in particular, this is somehow news. And for years, many of us, myself included, have said while the government pretends to be a friend of the resource sector, it's actually been one of its worst enemies. I can remember the Minister of Natural Resources standing up and saying, and then committing to paper in an open letter to the Canadian people that were raising questions that the very people he now says he respects and wants relationship with were radicals, foreign-funded radicals, Mr. Speaker. That's what they called them. He went further to say, well, they must be enemies of the state. What overheated, overblown, and ignorant rhetoric from a federal minister of the Crown to then suggest that that doesn't have an impact on relationship is also ignorant, is short-sighted. That somehow he thought this would increase certainty on the land base, that First Nations would suddenly say, oh, well, he called us enemies of the state. He called us foreign-funded radicals. Well, let's just agree to whatever plans this government has in mind. Well, of course not. That's not what a Canadian reaction would be. That's not how First Nations have reacted. They've reacted as they properly should. They were insulted. They were told that their rights and their views didn't matter, and if they had any views and ideas that were contrary to what the Conservative government believed, well, then that must have made them enemies of the state. Well, we hear that kind of language in other countries, Mr. Speaker, and it's language and it's rhetoric that's offensive. My Conservative colleagues across the way are shaking their heads. I agree. How dare a Minister of the Crown get up and say anybody opposed to the government's idea must be foreign-funded radicals? That's what he said. He said anyone raising questions must be enemies of the state. This is how you build relationship. Well, they would do well to listen to the report that we have in hand today. They would do well to listen and actually act upon the recommendations of Mr. Eyford. And it was an interesting moment where the Prime Minister had it here just today, because one of the specific recommendations was to construct a tripartite relationship with the provinces, the federal government, and First Nations. The Prime Minister had an opportunity today. They've been sitting on the report for 4 days now to say, well, we're interested in that recommendation. We see it as so critical for the development of the resources the government claims to care about that we will act. We will show the leadership that Mr. Eyford and the First Nations people of Canada are calling for. We see it in Bill C-15, some attempt by the government to finally, after many, many years in power, listen to the people of the North, to listen to the idea that giving up some of Ottawa's power in this regard would be a good idea. They did throw that little string back. They couldn't quite make it all the way. They're keeping the MVRMA in so that the government still has discretion, the federal government has discretion over land and water uses in the territories. We find that a bit unfortunate, somewhat curious. There's a 5-year review of this particular article in the bill, and that's something that's encouraging to us. But if they think that the legislation won't end up in court, if they haven't properly consulted First Nations, then they can expect only that, and then spend millions of Canadians' taxpayer dollars defending their bill in court. It seems to me so much more efficient to have the conversation up front, to have the consultation up front and make the accommodations before going through. But they, time and time again, Mr. Speaker, go the opposite route, the bullying route, saying, take it or leave it. This is how it's going to be. We're the almighty, powerful federal government. This is how we're going to enact our policies on your land and your territory. Well, it doesn't work that way. And small groups like the Supreme Court of Canada have told this government time and time again, it doesn't work that way. The way it's going to work is that we protect our constitutional rights in this country. We believe in them, and New Democrats believe in defending those rights each and every day. So when it comes to Bill C-15, devolution bill, allowing greater transfer of power to the territories, New Democrats will support this. We'll allow the debate to go on today. Here are more views. Perhaps the government will take even some notes. Wouldn't that be nice for a change? Show a little humility from time to time. Who knows? We might even allow Parliament to do its job, which would hold government to account and improve legislation that we deal with. Because too often, we've seen the other approach from this government, the arrogant approach, the bullying approach that says the legislation is perfect as it is, we'll accept no amendments, no changes, no ideas, not just from the opposition, but from any witnesses and experts that we bring to the table. Now, when you're dealing with First Nations, it goes a step further. That means the courts get involved. Constitutions must be addressed and redressed. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that a new day will dawn. I only pray that there will be a conversion on the road to Damascus for this Conservative government, that they'll finally realize their bullying approach won't work, that First Nations constitutional rights are guaranteed, and that to actually listen, to consult, and accommodate is the only way that this country will receive and absolutely generate its full prosperity for all people, not just for a select few. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.